Imagine this. You're sitting peacefully in the park you've called home for over 30 years. The morning sun is just beginning to rise, casting a golden glow over the familiar surroundings. You've spent countless hours in this spot, sipping coffee, reading the newspaper, and watching the world wake up. But then out of nowhere, a young officer approaches you with a stern expression and demands to know if you belong here. How would you react? Would you be calm, or would your heart start racing, confused and frustrated by the sudden confrontation? What if this moment of peace, the very one you've treasured for years, suddenly spirals into something far more intense? All because of how you look. And then the twist. What happens when the officer discovers the truth about the man he's trying to intimidate? A story that begins in quiet solitude quickly turns into a confrontation about justice, karma, and a powerful revelation that leaves everyone stunned. Stay with us to witness how a single peaceful morning set off a chain of events that would change everything. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to drop where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to hit subscribe. The sun had only just begun to peek over the horizon in Trenton, Tennessee. The city was still quiet, wrapped in the soft light of early morning. Shafts of golden sunlight filtered through the tall oak trees, casting long shadows across Grant Park. The air was cool, crisp, and calm, the kind of morning that made you stop, breathe deeply, and savor the peace. It was rare, a precious break from the chaos of the world. On an old wooden bench, near the heart of the park, sat Raymond Brooks. He was an elderly man, his hands worn and rough from a lifetime of hard work. His fingers wrapped around a warm cup of coffee, the steam rising in lazy swirls. His salt and pepper hair was neatly cut short, a subtle reminder of his days in the military. His posture, still straight despite the years that had passed, showed the strength of a man who had endured much, both physically and mentally. Raymond was a fixture in this park. For almost 30 years, he had started each day the same way, quietly sipping his coffee, reading the news, and watching the world slowly come to life around him. A jogger might wave as they passed. A couple walking their dog might offer a nod. Raymond would always return each gesture with a warm smile. But today, something felt different. The air seemed charged with an unspoken tension, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The park was mostly empty, just a few early risers scattered about, but the usual sense of peace was missing. Raymond took another slow sip of his coffee, eyes flicking to the entrance of the park. He saw the officer approaching, a young man in uniform, walking with a sense of purpose. At first, Raymond didn't think much of it. Trenton wasn't a big town, and the local officers were familiar faces. But this officer was different. His face was hard, his steps purposeful. He moved with the kind of authority that felt just a little too heavy for the occasion. Raymond's eyes met the officer's gaze, and he felt a sudden, unsettling rush of heat in his chest. His heartbeat quickened, a tightness in his throat. He wasn't doing anything wrong, not a thing out of the ordinary. But the officer's eyes, there was something there that made him uneasy. The officer, Officer David Clark, approached with a confidence that felt more like intimidation. His boots crunched on the gravel path as he walked directly toward Raymond. Raymond kept his eyes on the folded newspaper in his lap, hoping beyond hope that the officer would simply keep walking past. "Good morning," the officer said, his voice firm, but laced with something that made it feel more like an accusation than a greeting. Raymond looked up, offering a polite smile. "Morning, officer." But the officer didn't smile back. Instead, he stood a few feet away, hands resting on his utility belt. His eyes studied Raymond, scanning him with an intensity that made the air feel heavier. "What are you doing here, sir?" The question was direct, sharp, like a challenge. Raymond's brow furrowed in confusion. "Just enjoying my coffee. Been coming to this park for years." The officer didn't seem to believe him. His gaze narrowed, his eyes suspicious. "Do you live around here?" Raymond nodded, his smile slowly fading. "Lived a few blocks away for more than 30 years. This is my neighborhood." For a moment, the officer didn't say anything. He seemed to weigh Raymond's words carefully, sizing him up, searching for something, anything, that could validate whatever suspicion had formed in his mind. Then, without warning, he asked, "Do you have any ID on you?" The request was so abrupt, so completely out of the blue, that Raymond was taken aback. He'd never been asked for ID in the park before, especially not for just sitting on a bench. He hesitated, looking at the officer's unreadable face. ID, Raymond repeated, his voice steady but tinged with disbelief. I'm not sure why I'd need that. I'm just sitting here, minding my own business. The officer's lips pressed into a thin line. I need to verify that you belong in this neighborhood, he said, his tone growing colder, more insistent. We've had some issues lately. Raymond felt an old frustration stirring in his chest. He'd lived through segregation, through decades of being told where he could and couldn't go. And now, here he was in 2024, in his own neighborhood, in a park he had helped protect and preserve. And he was being treated like this. But Raymond wasn't a young man anymore. He wasn't filled with the fiery anger that had once driven him to stand up against injustice. Now it was more exhaustion than anything else. Officer, Raymond said slowly, keeping his voice calm despite the tension building. I've been sitting on this bench long before you were even born. I don't think I need to prove anything. For a split second, the officer looked startled, but his expression quickly hardened. He stepped closer, his hand resting ominously on his holster. Sir, he said, his voice low and threatening, I'm going to need you to show me some identification. The tension in the air thickened as the confrontation started to draw attention. A few passers-by slowed their pace, watching the exchange with growing concern. But no one intervened. Not yet. Raymond slowly reached for his cane, which was resting against the bench beside him. Using it to steady himself, he rose, the weight of the years pressing down on his legs. He wasn't looking for trouble, but he wasn't about to let this officer push him around either. I'm not causing any trouble, officer, Raymond said quietly, his eyes locking with Clark's. But I'm not about to let you treat me like a criminal for sitting in a park. The standoff seemed to hang in the air, each man holding his ground. Officer Clark, young and inexperienced, felt his authority slipping. Raymond, tired but resolute, refused to back down. And then, just as things were about to boil over, someone else entered the scene. From behind a row of tall hedges, a figure emerged. Kelvin Williams, a retired schoolteacher, had been sitting nearby, quietly observing. The moment he noticed the officer's rising aggression, he knew he had to step in. Kelvin's footsteps were soft on the gravel, but his presence was undeniable. As he neared the two men, Raymond's body relaxed slightly, a flicker of relief passing over his face. Is there a problem here, officer? Kelvin asked, his voice calm but firm, cutting through the tension. The officer, clearly caught off guard, snapped his gaze toward Kelvin. This is none of your concern, sir, he snapped, frustration evident in his voice. But Kelvin didn't back down. Instead, he moved a little closer to Raymond, positioning himself between the officer and the elderly man. It is my concern now, Kelvin said, his voice unwavering. I've been sitting over there for a while, and I couldn't help but overhear. I heard an elderly man, a longtime resident of this neighborhood, being harassed for sitting in a public park. The officer's face turned red with anger. His grip on his holster tightened, but Kelvin stood his ground, unwavering in his calm. And what I see, Kelvin continued, is a man overstepping his authority. The situation teetered on the edge of chaos. The officer's frustration was palpable, his control slipping away. Just as things seemed ready to explode, another voice, deep, authoritative, rang out across the park like a crack of thunder. That's enough. The tension snapped like a rubber band as the men turned toward the voice. Coming toward them, walking briskly, was Captain James Matthews. A seasoned officer, Matthews had witnessed the entire exchange from across the street, and had hurried over as soon as he realized what was happening. Clark, Matthews barked as he approached, his voice leaving no room for argument. Stand down. Officer Clark's face drained of color as he immediately took a step back, his hand falling from his holster. Matthews turned to Raymond and Kelvin, his expression softening slightly. Gentlemen, he said, his tone respectful, is everything all right here? Kelvin nodded slowly, the tension easing from his shoulders. I think we're all right now, Captain. But your officer here seemed a little overzealous. Matthews turned to Clark, his eyes narrowing. Clark, what exactly do you think you're doing? Clark's bravado had completely evaporated. He stammered, his voice small. I was just checking to see if he belonged here, sir. We've had complaints. Complaints, Matthews interrupted, his voice growing sharper. About an elderly man, sitting quietly in a park, minding his own business? Clark swallowed hard, glancing nervously between the two men. It was a moment of reckoning. A quiet morning had escalated into something neither man could have anticipated, both a test of patience and a reminder of the power of standing up for what's right. The tension in the air was palpable as Matthews stood there, facing the two men in front of him. His mind was racing, confusion and frustration mixing into a blur of emotions. He didn't even know who this officer was, but it hardly mattered. What mattered was the look in his eyes, the defiance, and the subtle aggression that simmered just beneath the surface. You don't need to, Matthew snapped sharply, cutting through the tension like a knife. This is a public park. You don't harass people just because they're sitting in a public space. Raymond, who had been eerily quiet through the exchange, finally spoke. His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable frustration in it, something raw and honest that couldn't be hidden. I've been coming to this park for 30 years, he said, locking eyes with Captain Matthews. Never had a problem until today. Matthews' jaw tightened, frustration bubbling up in his chest. You shouldn't have had one today, he muttered, his voice hardening. This is not how we do things. He turned to Clark, his words now carrying an undeniable weight. Go back to the station. I'll deal with you later. Clark hesitated, the air thick with tension, before giving a stiff nod and trudging away. The sound of his boots scraping against the gravel was like a distant drumbeat, slowly fading into the distance. As Clark disappeared, the heaviness in the air seemed to lessen, but there was still something lingering, an unease, a sense that nothing was quite right. Matthews let out a slow breath and turned back to Raymond and Kelvin, his expression softening. I'm sorry about that, he said quietly, the words heavy with sincerity. That was unacceptable. I'll make sure it doesn't happen again. Raymond studied him for a moment, his eyes sharp but weary, before nodding slightly. I appreciate that, Captain, he said, his voice still calm, but carrying an undertone of doubt. But this isn't the first time something like this has happened. And I doubt it'll be the last. A sigh escaped Matthews, the weight of his responsibility pressing down on him. I know, he admitted, the words sounding like a confession. But I'm working on it. We're trying to change things. Kelvin, who had been silent since Clark's departure, spoke up, his voice carrying the gravity of the situation. It's going to take more than just trying, Captain, he said, his words firm. It's going to take action. Real change. Matthews nodded, his resolve hardening. You're right, he said, his tone now more determined. And I promise you things will change. I'll make sure of it. Raymond, his posture still stiff but his voice steady, looked out over the park, his gaze distant. I hope so, he muttered quietly, as if speaking to himself more than anyone else. I really hope so. The park, once again, seemed to fall into a heavy silence. Matthews watched Clark disappear, his figure growing smaller in the distance. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling deeply. This wasn't new to him. He had seen situations like this before. He had been on the force long enough to understand the challenges that plagued his community. Turning back to Raymond, he used the older man's first name, a sign of respect, of familiarity. I know this can't fix what just happened, Matthews began, his voice soft. But I want you to know we're not all like that. Clark, he's new. He's still learning. The words felt empty even as they left his mouth, but they were the only ones he could offer. Raymond didn't respond immediately. Instead, his eyes wandered, taking in the park that had always been a source of peace for him. It had always been his escape. But today it felt different. It's always something, he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else, his grip tightening on his cane. Kelvin gave a tight nod, his expression grim. It's not just about learning, Captain. It's about understanding. Clark's not just new. He came in here already thinking he knew what to expect from us. That's the problem. Matthews shifted uncomfortably, the weight of the truth sinking in. He knew Kelvin was right. There was a culture within the department, one that had been ingrained long before he ever put on the badge. And changing that culture, it wasn't going to be easy. But Matthews wasn't the type to back down. I'm not going to make excuses for him, he replied, his tone more resolute. He'll face consequences for this. And more than that, we'll be implementing new training. It won't just be for Clark either. Raymond's eyes met his with a quiet, bitter chuckle. Training, huh? He scoffed, the sound dark with disbelief. You think training is going to change what's in his heart? For a moment, Matthews didn't speak. He had heard this same question countless times, from men like Raymond and women in the community, who had grown weary of empty promises. The truth was, he didn't know if training could fix what was broken, but it was the only thing he had to offer. It's a start, he finally said, though even he wasn't entirely convinced. Raymond sighed, his shoulders sagging with the weight of years. Years that had etched deep lines into his face, years that had worn him down. He looked up at Matthews, exhaustion in his eyes. I've seen starts before, Captain, he said softly, his voice tinged with resignation. I've seen them come and go. What I haven't seen is a finish. Kelvin watched the exchange, his heart heavy. He respected Matthews, knew him well. But respect didn't blind him to the issues that still festered. He placed a hand on Raymond's shoulder, offering silent support. I'm going to hold you to that, Captain, he said firmly. Because this can't keep happening. Matthews met Kelvin's eyes, a flicker of something deeper passing between them. For the first time, Kelvin saw something beyond the badge. There was fatigue, yes, but there was also determination. You have my word, Matthews said, his voice steady. I'm not just saying this to calm things down. We need real change. I'll make sure of it. Raymond, feeling the weight of the morning catching up to him, motioned toward the bench. I think I'm going to sit for a minute, he murmured, his body moving slowly, as if the very act of standing was too much. The cane tapped lightly against the pavement as he lowered himself onto the bench, taking a deep breath as the exhaustion set in. Kelvin sat down beside him, glancing at Matthews one last time, before settling into the silence. Matthews lingered for a moment longer, as if searching for the right words. But in the end, he just gave a respectful nod before walking away. The park seemed to settle once again, but the peaceful atmosphere was far from restored. The silence between Raymond and Kelvin was thick, broken only by the distant sounds of joggers and birds. Raymond's gaze was fixed on his hands, the lines etched deep in his skin, a map of his life's struggles. The park had always been his escape, but today it felt different. Tainted. I'm getting too old for this, Raymond muttered, his voice worn and low. Kelvin, gazing out at the park, turned to look at his friend. Ray, you're not too old, he replied softly. You're just tired. And you've got every right to be. Raymond let out a deep breath and nodded slowly. Maybe you're right. But it doesn't make it any easier. For years, Raymond had fought battles that no one else seemed to notice, battles for equality, for civil rights. He had seen progress, but in moments like this, it felt like it was all slipping away. You know, Raymond began, his voice distant. When I was young, I used to think that if we just pushed hard enough, we'd get somewhere. That things would be different for the next generation. Kelvin leaned back, listening intently. He had heard the stories of Raymond's younger years, of the marches, the protests, the fight for justice. He admired the man's resilience. Things have changed, Raymond continued. I've seen it. But days like this, they make me wonder. Makes me wonder if we've really come as far as we think. Kelvin didn't answer right away. He let the words hang in the air, giving them the space they needed to settle in. He knew the truth of Raymond's words. The progress they had fought for was real, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. Maybe we haven't, Kelvin finally said. But that doesn't mean we give up. I don't think you've ever been the type to give up. Raymond gave a tired smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. No, he muttered. I guess not. But it gets harder, Kelvin. Every year it gets harder. Kelvin leaned forward, his voice steady as he spoke. I know it does. But that's why we keep going. That's why we don't stop. Because we can't afford to. The two men sat in silence for a moment, letting the sun warm their faces. Raymond looked up at the trees, watching as the branches swayed gently in the breeze. For a brief second, the park felt peaceful again, like it had before the officer's arrival. Raymond wished it could always feel that way. Just as he was about to speak, Kelvin's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and let out a low sigh. Looks like this is getting around, he muttered, holding up his phone for Raymond to see. On the screen was a local news alert. Officer confronts elderly man in park, community outrage grows. Raymond squinted at the screen, a frown tugging at the corners of his mouth. Didn't take long, did it? Kelvin shook his head, putting the phone away. Nothing stays quiet these days. It's probably already trending. Raymond leaned back on the bench, closing his eyes for a moment. So what now? Kelvin didn't have an answer. He didn't know what would happen next, whether this would blow over or spark something bigger. But one thing was certain. They weren't going to let it slide. We keep going, Kelvin said firmly, his voice calm but resolute. We speak up. We make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug. Raymond opened his eyes, giving a small nod. All right, he said, his voice quiet but steady. All right. And so, as the community began to respond, as whispers turned to phone calls and posts flooded the internet, the quiet confrontation in the park evolved into something much larger. By the afternoon, a crowd had gathered at Grant Park. Raymond stayed back, watching from a distance as people arrived, some carrying signs, others just standing together, united by something bigger than any of them. It felt surreal. This wasn't what Raymond had wanted. He had come to the park for peace and quiet, but now his world had been upended. Still, as he watched, something stirred inside him. This wasn't just about him. It was about something far greater. And though he was tired, so tired he couldn't walk away, Kelvin stood beside him, silent for a while, before nudging Raymond gently. Looks like people are ready to speak up. Raymond nodded, scanning the crowd. Yeah, guess they are. The crowd had grown, swelling to nearly 50 people now. Neighbors, strangers, young and old, all united by something Raymond couldn't deny. This was bigger than him, bigger than any of them. Someone from the crowd waved at him, calling him forward. Raymond glanced at Kelvin, who gave a small nod of encouragement. They want to hear from you, Kelvin said gently. Raymond hesitated, but then he straightened up, his old military posture returning. Slowly, he began to walk toward the crowd, his cane tapping lightly against the pavement with each step. Raymond had spoken before. He'd led marches and rallies in his younger years, his voice echoing across crowds urging change. But this moment felt different, didn't it? This wasn't just about the cause, it was personal. Deeply, painfully personal. As he stood before the crowd, the weight of it all pressed on his chest. He wasn't prepared for this, but there was no turning back now. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward, his voice steady, cutting through the once boisterous, now silenced crowd. I didn't come here today looking for a fight, he began, his words deliberate and slow, as if he was choosing each one carefully, weighing their meaning. He paused, looking at the sea of faces, searching for understanding, searching for something that might ease the knot tightening in his stomach. I came here for peace, just like I do every morning, he continued, his voice filled with resolve. But sometimes peace isn't enough. A hush fell over the crowd. There was a heaviness in the air now, a shared understanding of the pain that hung between each word. Raymond's eyes scanned the faces in front of him, searching, connecting. He saw it, the exhaustion, the unspoken stories, the scars of countless battles fought and lost. We've all been through this before, he said, his voice rising ever so slightly. We've all had moments where we were questioned, doubted, judged, not by the content of our character, but by the color of our skin. And there it was, the raw truth. And it's exhausting, he muttered, the weight of his own words settling over the crowd like a fog. The silence stretched thick and heavy, as Raymond stood still, letting the truth sink in. It was a moment of collective reflection, a realization that their struggles were not isolated, that the fight had no end in sight. Raymond had never intended to be here, standing in front of a crowd, pouring his heart out. But there was no turning back now. I'm tired, he whispered almost to himself. But his words carried across the park, a subtle declaration that resonated deeply. Tired of being questioned, tired of having to prove I belong. His voice grew softer, more fragile, yet the conviction behind it didn't waver. I've lived in this neighborhood for decades. I've raised my children here. I've watched this park grow, helped it thrive. But even after all that, he paused, the weight of the years pressing down. I'm still made to feel like I don't belong. His gaze swept the crowd, making eye contact with as many people as he could, the shared connection palpable. Nods of understanding rippled through the crowd. Faces tightened, their collective pain written across every line, every glance. That young officer, Raymond continued, his voice tinged with frustration, saw me sitting here and decided I didn't belong. Why? Because I was sitting in a park while black? His words were sharp, biting, as a surge of anger flashed through his usually calm demeanor. I've seen this too many times. I saw it in the 60s and now here we are. Nothing's changed. A murmur passed through the crowd, the frustration bubbling to the surface. This wasn't just Raymond's fight anymore. It was theirs too. It was about more than one man's experience. It was about the shared history of a community. Kelvin stepped forward, his presence a silent but strong support at Raymond's side. Raymond paused, collecting his thoughts, before continuing, his voice building with a new intensity. We're tired but we can't stop, he said, each word growing stronger. Every time something like this happens, it takes a piece of us, but it also lights a fire. We've been through too much to let this slide. He leaned forward, his eyes locked on the crowd. If we let this go, what's stopping them from coming after the next person? Or the one after that? The crowd's energy surged, an electric charge building in the air. The anger, the hope, the frustration. It was all converging into something much bigger than this single moment. Kelvin stepped forward, his voice ringing with the same resolve. We all know what needs to happen. We can't just wait for the system to fix itself. We need to demand that it be fixed. That starts right here, right now. If you want to see change, we've got to be the ones to make it happen. A young woman from the crowd stepped forward, her voice cutting through the rising tension. We've had enough talks, she said, anger laced in her words. How do we make them listen? Raymond and Kelvin exchanged a glance. This wasn't going to be easy. Protests, petitions, discussions, they had all been tried before. But the time for silence had passed. We've got to show up, Kelvin said firmly. They need to see that we won't be silent anymore. We demand accountability. We demand better. The crowd erupted into conversation, energy crackling in the air. Plans were already taking shape. Rallies, petitions, organizing. Some had been involved in activism before, but many were newcomers, driven by a shared frustration with a system that had long ignored them. Raymond's heart swelled with a flicker of hope. He had been tired, was still tired. But as he looked around at the faces of the younger generation stepping up to lead, something stirred inside him. Maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. Kelvin placed a hand on Raymond's shoulder, offering quiet reassurance. We're not doing this alone, Ray, he said, his voice low but firm. Look around. People are ready. Raymond nodded, a small but genuine smile crossing his face. I know. It's time. The following days were a blur of meetings and actions, as word of the incident spread like wildfire through social media and local news. Soon, the whole city was buzzing with talk, not just about what had happened to Raymond, but about the systemic issues of racial profiling that had plagued their community for years. Kelvin, alongside a group of passionate organizers, set to work. They called meetings, sent emails, and met with local leaders to plan a rally that would shake the city. This wasn't just about Raymond. It was about everyone who had been targeted, judged, and marginalized. Raymond, however, wasn't sure he wanted to be at the center of it all. He had never sought the spotlight. But deep down, he knew this was bigger than his own discomfort. If his experience could spark change for the whole community, then it was worth it. The day of the rally arrived, and the park, once peaceful and quiet, was now filled with hundreds of people, determined, resolute, and ready for action. Signs reading "Justice for All," "We Belong," and "No More Silence" were raised high. The air was thick with purpose. Raymond stood at the front, leaning on his cane, watching as the crowd gathered. The energy was palpable. There was no turning back now. This was more than just a protest. It was a movement. As the speeches began, a young woman stepped up to the microphone, her voice strong and clear. She spoke of standing together, of holding the system accountable, of fighting not just for Raymond, but for everyone who had been unfairly targeted. When it was Raymond's turn to speak, the crowd fell silent. He made his way to the microphone, his cane tapping lightly against the wooden stage with each step. The moment felt surreal. He had stood in front of crowds like this before. But this time, There was something different in the air. Something that made the fight feel real again. "I've been here before," he began, his voice carrying over the sea of faces. "I've stood in front of crowds like this, fighting for the same things we're fighting for today. And I'll be honest with you, it's exhausting." A murmur of agreement rose from the crowd. But Raymond wasn't done. "But we can't stop," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "We can't let our exhaustion silence us. Because if we do, nothing changes. And I don't know about you, but I'm tired of waiting for change that never comes." His eyes swept across the crowd, each face a reminder of the years of struggle. "This isn't just about me. This is about all of us. It's about our children, our grandchildren. It's about making sure they don't have to fight these same battles." The crowd erupted into applause, but Raymond's passion was unstoppable. "We're here because we deserve better. We deserve to be treated with respect, with dignity. And if we don't demand it, then who will?" The applause grew louder, swelling with energy and determination. For the first time in a long time, Raymond felt a shift, a sense of hope that had been buried for far too long. This wasn't just another rally. This was the start of something real. As the rally ended, discussions about next steps began. It was clear. They weren't going to let this momentum die. Kelvin, Raymond, and the core group of organizers were already planning their next moves, pushing for change, real change. Captain Matthews, who had been watching from the sidelines, approached them. "That was powerful," he said, his expression resolute. "And I want you to know, I'm listening." Kelvin met his gaze, his expression cautious but hopeful. "That's a start, Captain. But we need more than just listening." "I know," Matthews replied, his voice firm. "I've already started making changes within the department. It won't happen overnight, but we're committed to making it right." Raymond studied him for a moment, then nodded. "It's a long road, Captain. But we'll hold you to that." Weeks passed in a blur of meetings, discussions, and a renewed sense of purpose. The movement in Trenton grew, gaining momentum and spreading across the community. Raymond, though reluctant to be in the spotlight, found himself at the heart of it all. He had thought he'd leave the fight to the younger generation, but here he was, once again fighting for change. "We've still got a long way to go," Raymond said quietly one day, as he sat with Kelvin in Grant Park, looking around at the familiar trees. But for the first time in a long time, there was optimism in his voice. "But I think we're headed in the right direction." Kelvin smiled, leaning back on the bench. "Yeah, Ray, we are." As the sun set over the park, they both knew the fight was far from over. But together, they had started something that couldn't be stopped. It was a crisp morning when Raymond sat on his usual bench in Grant Park, the world around him still waking up. The sound of birds chirping, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, and the rhythmic footsteps of early risers filled the air. He was lost in his paper, scanning the news, when he felt a shift, a presence near him. He looked up, his gaze meeting a young woman standing hesitantly in front of him. She was in her late 20s, wearing a simple green hoodie and jeans, her curly hair pulled into a messy bun. Something about her demeanor told him she was not just another passerby. "Mr. Brooks." Her voice was soft, laced with a mix of respect and uncertainty. Raymond blinked, squinting against the bright sunlight as he set his paper aside. "Yes, that's me," he replied, his voice warm, inviting. The woman shifted nervously on her feet, her eyes darting down to the ground before meeting his again. She took a slow breath, as if gathering the courage to speak. "I've been coming to the rallies," she began, her words cautious but sincere. "I'm not really the type to speak up, but I wanted to thank you." Raymond raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Thank me? For what?" he asked, folding his paper carefully, his full attention on her now. The woman's voice grew steadier, a hint of strength building. "For standing up, for giving us a voice." Her gaze softened, a vulnerability in her eyes that seemed to reflect the weight of unspoken words. I didn't think people like me would be heard. But you and Mr. Kelvin have been doing this for so long. And now it feels like maybe things can change." Raymond's lips curled into a tired smile, the kind only years of fighting for change could bring. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he let her words hang in the air between them. "It's not just me," he said quietly, his voice firm yet compassionate. "It's all of us. Every one of us has a role to play. You're part of this too. Every voice matters, even the quiet ones. Anita, as she introduced herself, seemed to absorb his words deeply, her posture softening. She looked down at the ground, her hands clasped nervously in front of her. I didn't think anyone would care what I had to say, she admitted, her voice laced with self-doubt. I mean, who am I? Just some girl working 2 jobs, trying to make ends meet. I didn't think I'd make a difference. Raymond's gaze softened, his voice firm as he shook his head. That's where you're wrong. Every person in this fight makes a difference. You're just as important as anyone else standing up. Don't doubt that for a moment. They sat together in the growing warmth of the morning, the park bustling with life, as people went about their daily routines. The sounds of joggers, children playing, and dogs barking filled the air. But for a moment, it felt as though the world around them had quieted. Anita, her nerves slowly easing, let out a long breath. I want to help, she said, her voice steady, though still unsure. But I don't know where to start. Raymond chuckled softly, a knowing smile on his face. No one knows where to start, he said. We all just figure it out along the way. Meanwhile, across town, the wheels of change were turning in another corner of the city. Kelvin, with the core group of community leaders, was finalizing the details of a public forum that would bring together city officials, police representatives, and concerned citizens. The goal? Transparency, real accountability. It was time for promises to be tested, for words to be backed by action. The night of the forum arrived, and the local high school auditorium was packed, the air thick with anticipation. People stood in the aisles, sat cross-legged on the floor, and filled every available space, eager for answers. Raymond and Kelvin stood near the front, the weight of the moment not lost on them. Kelvin glanced at Raymond, clipboard in hand, his brow furrowed in concentration. You ready for this, Ray? He asked. Raymond gave a nonchalant shrug, leaning on his cane as he scanned the crowd. Ready or not, here we are, he said, the words feeling like a quiet challenge. The evening opened with the usual introductions, city council members talking about their dedication to improving the community. But the crowd wasn't here for speeches. They were here for action, real solutions. The murmurs grew as Captain Matthews took the stage, his presence commanding yet uncertain. He had been at the rallies, had promised change, but promises were no longer enough. The crowd wanted more. I know why you're all here, Matthews began, his voice steady, but tinged with the weight of responsibility. You're here because the trust between this community and the police has been broken. And that's on us. He paused, his eyes sweeping over the crowd. What happened to Mr. Brooks should never have happened. And we're committed to making sure it never happens again. The crowd was restless. Some nodded, others crossed their arms, waiting for more. Matthews continued, his words carefully chosen. We've already started implementing new training that focuses on de-escalation, community engagement, and understanding the people we serve. It's not enough just to know the law. Officers need to know the people they're protecting. Some of the tension in the room eased, but it wasn't enough. People weren't here for words, they were here for change. A hand shot up from the back of the room. Training's fine, the voice called out. But how do we know this isn't just another round of empty promises? What are you actually going to do to hold officers accountable? The room went quiet, all eyes on Matthews. He nodded, acknowledging the gravity of the question. That's a fair point, he admitted. And it's not just about training. We're creating a civilian oversight board. A board made up of people from this community who will have direct access to police reports, body camera footage, and the ability to hold officers accountable. We can't police ourselves if the community doesn't trust us. This board will ensure transparency. A murmur of approval spread through the crowd. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a step forward, a real one. Raymond exchanged a look with Kelvin, both men silently processing what they had just heard. That's more than I thought they'd offer, Raymond muttered. Kelvin nodded. It's a start. The night went on, more questions, more stories shared. Stories of fear, humiliation, and broken trust. Matthews stood on stage the entire time, listening, absorbing, not interrupting. By the end of the night, it was clear the forum had only scratched the surface. This was going to be a long journey. As the crowd began to disperse, Raymond and Kelvin lingered near the stage, speaking with a few city officials. Captain Matthews approached them, his face weary but resolute. "Raymond, Kelvin," he greeted them, his voice heavy but respectful. "I know this isn't enough. I know there's more work to be done. But we're committed to doing it." Kelvin extended his hand, shaking Matthews's firmly. "We'll hold you to that, Captain. And if you need our help, you know where to find us." Matthews smiled faintly. "I'll take you up on that. We need voices like yours if we're going to make this work." Raymond stood back, watching the exchange, and something inside him shifted. He had seen this kind of thing before. Promises, empty words. But tonight felt different. Was it Matthews's exhaustion? The weariness of a man who had worked within a flawed system and was finally ready to face the truth? Or was it the crowd? The people who had come together, not just to demand answers, but to be part of the solution? Whatever it was, Raymond could feel it deep in his bones. This was just the beginning. In the weeks that followed, the Civilian Oversight Board was established. The community dove in, eager to get involved, and Raymond found himself more connected than he had ever anticipated. It wasn't the end of his role, not yet. The calls kept coming, the movement needed his experience, his guidance. He couldn't walk away. One day, sitting on his bench in Grant Park, Raymond looked out at the growing crowd, his park, his people. And there, standing in the distance, was Anita. Her familiar green hoodie made her hard to miss. She smiled shyly as she approached, sitting beside him, her posture more confident than before. Raymond couldn't help but tease, "You're becoming a regular." Anita laughed softly, nodding. "Yeah, I guess I am." They sat in silence for a while, the world moving around them. There was peace in that moment, a peace that had been hard-won. And as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the park, Raymond knew that they were on the right path. The road ahead was long, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was walking it alone. And that was enough for now. "Ready to speak up?" Raymond asked, his voice full of quiet pride. Anita looked at him, her eyes steady. "I think I'm ready. I've been watching from the sidelines for too long. I think it's time." Raymond smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "You'll do just fine. I know it."